right, guys, we're going to get started here. Welcome to Chattanooga for those not from town, and welcome back for those that are from here. I'm Michael Walton. I'm the executive director at Green Spaces. Green Spaces is Chattanooga's sustainability nonprofit. Our mission is advancing the sustainability of living, working, and building in the Chattanooga region. We do that with a wide range of programs focused on those different topics. So under our living umbrella, we have Empower outreach and workshops that are focused on addressing utility burden, lowering per capita energy consumption, especially for people that need that help the most. We've been working with the city on the integrated community sustainability plan. We've just launched a new healthy home assessments and improvement program with Erlanger Women's Services. Under the working part of our mission, we have the Green Light Green Business Certification, the Green Leader Professional Certificate, and our Good Use Nonprofit Energy Upgrade Grants in partnership with South Face in Atlanta. And then under the building part of our umbrella, which is why we're all here today, we, a few years ago, built our Next Gen Homes, which was Chattanooga's first net zero energy residential development. And we have our Build It Green Leadership and Workforce Development Program. In fact, we've got the big team is here with us today. If y'all will wave. And then we have the Chattanooga Green Prix, an electric car race for K through 12 students coming up October 28th and 29th. And the thing we're launching today is a regenerative building project, which will be a future home for green spaces. So all of these programs focus on this idea of the triple bottom line. And so how do we think about every decision we make and how it affects both economic, environmental, and social outcomes? And then across all of these different areas, how do we sort of move the needle and help people take simple steps toward improving these outcomes? And today we're here to think about how buildings really underpin some of the challenges that we have as a community, as a society, as a planet, and what are the ways that buildings affect those systems? And how can we think about the built environment not just as doing less harm, but as doing more good and building a regenerative economy, a regenerative planet, a regenerative place. So we've got a really great lineup of speakers today, super excited. And to kick us off, we have Jermaine Freeman, who is the senior advisor to the City of Chattanooga Mayor Tim Kelly. And I'll let Jermaine take it away.
All right, thank you, Michael. As Michael said, my name is Jermaine Freeman, and I serve as Senior Advisor to Mayor Tim Kelly of the City of Chattanooga, and my focus is economic development. And so with that, on behalf of the City of Chattanooga, I want to welcome you to the Regenerative Design Summit. For those of you who are not from here, I welcome you to Chattanooga, and we hope that you stay beyond the next 2 days and that you really make sure that you spend some money here in our city. So I am an economic developer by trade. My focus in the mayor's office is working on economic development. So for me, buildings are great. Buildings bring more opportunity. They bring more jobs. They bring more property tax revenue for our city. They bring more industry. And so, but as we think about that, and as we think about the work that you guys do and why it's so important, it's not enough for us just to build the environment anymore. Now we've got to design buildings that are much more sustainable, buildings that are much more friendlier for the climate and for the environment, and also buildings that also take into consideration kind of the public health needs that we all have. And so whether or not those public health needs are designing buildings that encourage people to get up and move around more, or buildings that help to sort of mitigate some of the challenges involved with some of the diseases that we face, like COVID-19. Obviously, the work that you guys do in terms of helping us to build an environment of the future and in helping us to build sustainable buildings and designed sustainable spaces where people can interact is more important than ever. I can't underscore how important that work is, even on the economic development side, as we look at ways to do more economic development and to bring more industry and more construction and opportunities to our city. The conversation that we often have now is, how do we make the buildings more sustainable? How do we make the buildings so that they are less of an impact on our environment and our neighborhoods, and more environmentally friendly and sustainable? I am proud to say that I live in a LEED Silver certified building, and I'm very, very happy about that. But again, we want to welcome you to Chattanooga. We hope that you enjoy your time here, and for those of you who are from here, it's good to see you again. And if you ever need anything from the mayor's office, please just reach out to Michael, and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jermaine. Thank you, Jermaine. And we really appreciate your support and the support of Mayor Kelly for all of these sustainability initiatives, and we look forward to great things to come. Next up, we have Lilliekeener. So Lily uses her commercial interior and sustainable design experience to serve tribal and federal clients across the country. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and strives to benefit communities like hers by designing safe, healthy interior environments that provide beautiful and functional spaces for all building occupants. Lily has contributed to a variety of building projects and appreciates the nuances and challenges of varied project types. She recognizes the building industry's potential positive environmental impact and is a proponent of responsible building practices. Her expertise lies in community and client relations, conceptual design, FF&E selection, climate adaptation, planning, and architectural drafting. She enjoys cycling, crafting, and spending time with her family in her free time. I do want to just mention, though, the really important thing about Lily's presentation is that this idea of regenerative design is not a new idea. In fact, it's one that is very old and very rooted in this place, but one that we sort of departed from. And so I'll let Lily take it away.
All right. Sio Nagad, Lilliekeener, Dogwadoa. Hi, everyone. My name is Lilliekeener. It's wonderful to be here today. So we'll start off with this slide, and it's important because we all know that our history shapes our communities, the way our societies run, the way our day-to-day lives operate. So today, I'm going to speak to you about the history of the Cherokee people that have lived here in this area on these lands since time immemorial. So like Michael said, I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is just 2 short flights away. And so Tulsa is near the 14-county jurisdiction that the Cherokee Nation Reservation covers. I've worked on a lot of tribal building projects throughout the last 8 or so years throughout the Southwest and the Midwest. And those include multifamily, healthcare, industrial types of projects. So that's been a learning experience in and of itself, because I was working outside of my tribe, with tribes with different backgrounds, cultures, histories than my own. So I've learned a lot that way. My family is involved in tribal politics, traditional crafts, art, language preservation, and thankfully have passed a lot of that down to me, and I hope to continue to pass it on to my nieces and nephews. So if you're wondering why I look the way I do, it's just genetics. So I look like my mom. She's of European descent. She has light skin and brown hair. I don't look like my dad, who's half Cherokee with darker skin and hair. So it's just the way the dice rolled, and here I am. So my Cherokee roots are from my dad, and then my mom's roots, funny enough, the family name is Heatherly, and they have roots in La Follette up the road. And then I have some great uncles who worked at Oak Ridge. So my roots are around here in a lot of different ways. And then my family name on my dad's side is Rattling Gourd. So I've been able to trace those and learn even more about the area. So, my tribe, Cherokee Nation, is one of 3 bands of the Cherokee people, and we'll learn as I talk some more why there are 3 bands of what used to be a united group of Cherokee people. So this image is showing the big red spot is the traditional homelands of Cherokee people. So these homelands would have existed long before these borders existed, right? They're just overlaid to give you context of how big and far-reaching the homelands existed. So you can see where we are, Chattanooga, smack dab in the middle, and then how far those homelands would have stretched out to borders created by rivers and that were kind of stopped by neighboring tribes who were already there. So the other 2 bands of the Cherokee people that exist today are the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, who you probably have heard of, maybe know someone. So they're based in Cherokee, North Carolina, on reservation there. And we're going to talk more about why they are still within this red spot. Then the 3rd band is also in Northeast Oklahoma. They're the United Kituwa Band. So by the end of this talk, you'll know why there are 3. And all of the history that's happening, it's going to change a united group of people into 3 legal entities. So we can see already those effects are happening. So you have that information. So I hope you'll open your mind as you get ready for a couple of days of conferencing and take in some of this history that's often not taught in schools, or maybe it's de-emphasized. And so I'll focus on this area as it relates to you guys who probably mostly live here or around here, and just reflect on the fact that in what we know now as the Americas, North, Central, and South, that tens of millions of indigenous people have lived here long before we were ever here today. There were bustling societies and trade networks, and we can learn a lot from their approach to everyday life, which in and of itself was very regenerative, and how they survived against great odds. So we're covering centuries of history, and we've got about 45 minutes or so. So I'll be speaking broadly, but I hope to speak to you guys on the next couple of days if you want to talk about the details. So we'll travel back in time to before European contact in this area, and then we'll time travel forward up to present day. So before European contact, when this red section of Cherokee people was alive and thriving before the state borders were here, population estimates are about 25 to 50,000 people. So not densely populated, but the societies were based in towns or townships. Digaduha is the word for those. Let me go forward. Oh, it worked. Okay. So this is what's known as Osi, sometimes called Aussie. It's a wattle and daub style house. So river cane was used to make the walls, and then it was plastered with mud and clay, and then a thatched roof, which was also covered in mud and clay. So this would have been used for the winter time, so a place to stay warm, cook, and sleep. In the colder months, and in the summer, you would have had just 4 wood posts with a thatched roof for shade. So that was something you could cook under, rest under, get out of the heat a little bit. So you would have had smaller OCs here for individual family units, and then larger ones for more communal buildings. So we have the map and the mental map of where the Cherokees were, but there was so much travel going on, trade and cultural exchange between the neighboring tribes, right? So that's why we find different artifacts from miles and miles away in Cherokee homelands, right? So the the trading of objects, ideas, different methods of farming, creating clothing and tools were all passed around. So great amounts of knowledge in traditional ways just passed on. So the societies were going to be set up in the Digaduha, the township. So these would have been situated in smaller community units. And the Cherokee society was and is matrilineal. So the mothers and the grandmothers were the heads of clans. They were the heads of family units. And if you got married, the married couple would move into the mom's house. So different than mainstream society's patriarchal system today, where a man is usually the head of the household. So as the women were running the clans, the Cherokee people stuck with, and still have, a 7-clan system. So within those clans and then within communities, there were defined roles that allowed people to maintain everyday life, get everything done that needed to be done, and take care of each other. So you had hunters who would go get wild game and bring back hides and bones for clothing and tools. Warriors to protect the people, maybe battle neighboring tribes. And if there were conflicts, like maybe over land or like hunting land rights with a neighboring tribe, sometimes conflicts were settled with a traditional game of stickball. So stickball was adopted or borrowed by the French, and they created lacrosse. So those games have similar concepts. So as far as settling conflicts with stickball games, it was something that didn't result in the amount of death and injury that the actual battles cost. Who else did you have? You had gatherers who would gather wild plants as well as cultivate crops, but they would always leave enough plants for regeneration. Cherokees also had a war and a peace chief, so 2 separate people, and they would act when the time was appropriate. Fire keepers was another role, so they would create sacred fires and continue to keep those burning. So in the middle of town, if it wasn't a time for ceremony, they would maintain embers of a sacred fire that was specific to that township and keep them burning. And I'm told that those same fire keepers kept those fires burning, those embers, as Cherokees were removed from traditional homelands to Indian territory. So those were always kept burning, and then they were built up for ceremonies. So there was a balance with all of these roles and clans. So lands were held in common, and everyone had what they needed. So I've been told that there was very little poverty, very little hunger, and so this balance of roles was a very sustainable system, and we know that because estimates range that Cherokee people have been in those homelands for 12,000 years. So the language, Cherokee language, was spoken at this time, so all traditions and stories were passed down orally, but that would change in a couple hundred years, as we'll see. And then spirituality, dances, ceremonies were performed based on seasons, time, big life events, milestones, those kinds of things, and have been passed on and are still observed today. Okay, so that was all pre-contact, so everything sounds great, right? A name that might come to mind for you guys is Christopher Columbus, but I'm here to tell you he never reached what we know as the contiguous 48 states. He was down near Cuba and Haiti, and he created a bunch of death and destruction down there. He didn't come to the U.S. So the main kind of start of contact with the Cherokee people that we consider is around 1540, and that was Hernando de Soto. So let me move slides, I think. Yep. So his explorations started off the major European influence and colonization of this area. So Hernando de Soto introduced things like horses and pigs. You're starting to see log cabins, so a different style of building. And then starting to see stick-built buildings as well, and then individual plots of land and a gridded city system. So the gridded city system doesn't necessarily take into account the natural ebbs and flows, the access to natural resources, or the natural elements that already exist on the land. So a different society setup that's being influenced and pushed on the Cherokee people. And then the European style of farming was often not regenerative. It often wore out the land, and that concept alone encouraged Europeans to move farther west to find new land to treat like that. The European influence also flipped the matriarchal system, like we already spoke about, and encouraged a patriarchal system. So we're starting to see the breakdown of a lot of the traditional Cherokee ways that had already been going on for thousands of years. So as we move forward in time, as we go through European influence and colonization, and we get through kind of the mid-end of 1600s, the Cherokees are becoming dependent on trade goods. So things like blankets, pots and kettles, iron traps, horses, and guns. They're changing the way societies cook, gather food, which foods they're eating. And then having guns, of course, is changing how they fight. And there are beginnings of intermarriage, and then there's more cultural exchange still between Cherokees and other tribes, but also, of course, with Europeans. So we are in a very tumultuous time right now. So there are European influences, there is westward expansion, there's the ever-shrinking land holdings, right? And that's something that Cherokees would be very cognizant of, because the townships and places they used to travel would just be going away and shrinking. To add to that, in the mid-1700s, there were 2 smallpox epidemics. So we know today the terrible impact that disease can have on communities, and especially in a community as small as the Cherokees would have been at the time. So the first epidemic killed half the population, right, of the Cherokees. And so that would have been about 7,000 to 10,000 people died. They had about 20 years to recover in a way when the second epidemic came through and killed about a third of the population. So that was part of the biological exchange that happened between Cherokees and Europeans, which wouldn't have been intentional, but it was something that the Cherokees had no immunity to. So again, a tumultuous time, but also a time of recovery. With all this going on, I try to think about how would I have approached this situation, as there was so much change going on, right? And there are new roles within Cherokee societies. There are farmers who are farming the conventional European way. There are people that work in mills, mines, blacksmiths, using materials that they haven't traditionally, but they're learning to in ways that advance their ability to take care of their people. So we're still seeing log cabins as the main form of dwelling, and we still have the covered wood posts, just a shade structure for the summer. So Cherokees are still spending a lot of time outside and being in harmony with nature. So we're recovering from smallpox epidemic, and we are navigating the political and legal conflicts and influences of what's getting ready to become America, right? So at the end of the 1700s, Georgia becomes a state, Tennessee becomes a state, and those invisible border lines are created, which changes the legal status of Cherokees. So now they're wondering, are we citizens of Tennessee of Georgia, of Cherokee Nation, how are we defined in the eyes of the American government now? So when it comes to dealing with the Cherokees and with a lot of tribes, the American government wanted one representative to show up and speak for the tribe. But we know from earlier the Cherokees had at least one war and one peace chief. So there was never one representative. And with all of the fracturing of the townships and communities that's going on, it would have been impossible for one person to represent all of the desires and feelings of the Cherokee Nation. So that caused conflict when there was one person representing and making decisions for the Cherokee people. And as far as more building, one major influence would have been Christian missionaries who influenced building styles as well as financed buildings. So they built churches and schools and housing, usually stick-built, and in a way that was helpful, right? But it was encroachment on its own. And that Christian influence was prevalent then and is up to present day. So there's still Christian beliefs intertwined with traditional beliefs within Cherokee beliefs and a lot of other tribes. So building styles are changing, spending more time inside. And then the first brick home was built by a prominent Cherokee, Joseph Van. So this is the Van House in New Eshota. If you haven't had a chance to visit, it's really well kept up and restored. So you see the traditional log cabin that we have been seeing, but his brick home was really a sign of his wealth. So it's worth visiting for sure. And it was built in 1804, and just 30 or so years later, Joseph Van and his family would have been rounded up at gunpoint to then be removed to Indian Territory. So there's a mark in his house that is in reference to that, and we'll talk about that later. So with all of the fracturing of townships, the changes in society, there was definitely a threat of removal, right? Land holdings were becoming smaller. There was a looming threat of violence as well. So about 2,000 Cherokees, both mixed bloods and full bloods, went to Arkansas voluntarily, as voluntarily as you can be, I guess, in that situation. So we call those early settlers, and there's still a pretty large Cherokee community there in Arkansas, based on those early ancestors that went ahead and kind of removed themselves. So we'll talk about the Eastern Band, give a little bit of their history since we're really close to them. So their sort of attempt to survive was not to leave necessarily, it was to stay. So the Eastern Band stayed there in what is now Western North Carolina, and to do that, they gave up their Cherokee citizenship at the time, and then they became residents of North Carolina and operated under those state laws. So they were citizens of the state now, and they got along with the American government. And they had a little bit of an advantage being in the mountains because Americans had their eyes set on land in Georgia that was more fertile for farming and also had gold. So the Eastern Band stayed there in the hills and in a way were safer. So as we move forward into the era of removal, we'll talk about the Trail of Tears in a second, but there were also some very bright points in this area that need to be recognized too. So 1821, Sequoia's syllabary was created. So you may have heard the name Sequoia before, but he was a prominent Cherokee and a lot of times considered a genius because he took the spoken language of Cherokee and created 86 characters that represent syllables in the language. So each character is not like an alphabet where it's a letter. It creates a syllable, which are then put together to create words, phrases, and sentences. So his original syllabary was more script, more calligraphy type handwriting. And the characters you're seeing now with the pronunciation next to them were developed when the Cherokee Phoenix, a newspaper, was established. So this building's also in New Eshota. Worth a visit for sure. You can see the printing press that was used to print the Cherokee Phoenix in Cherokee and English. It's still in publication today and is distributed to members of the Cherokee Nation. If I didn't already say it, it was printed in Cherokee and English. So it was a way to distribute information and keep the Cherokee language alive in written form. So that was one very bright spot in this era. The Cherokees also created their first constitution in 1827, and it was heavily influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy, their style of leadership, but also had American and European influence as well. So the Cherokee Phoenix started getting published in 1828. And this was at a time when the distribution of information would have been extremely important, right? Because as the American government was passing acts, the states were passing laws that affected how Cherokees operated, where they could gather, things like that. So around this time, it became illegal for Cherokees to gather in Georgia. So that's why the site of Red Clay, which you've probably heard of, Red Clay National Park, is so important. So that was a camping and gathering site. And it was just over the border of Georgia in Tennessee, so it was legal to gather there. So councils and communities would gather there to communicate, make decisions, and try to figure out what to do next. So 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, and the removal era is in full swing. The Indian Removal Act affected most tribes in North America, and it affected them in different ways. So 1838 to 39 was the Trail of Tears, which I hope everyone has heard of and knows the basics of. There were multiple routes, including water routes. Oh, real quick. This is the Cherokee road system, which allowed for travel by horse and wagon. So it was really well established within what was then Cherokee country. Sorry, I missed a couple slides. So here's Red Clay Historic Park and the structure under which the council would have met and made decisions. Okay. So like I said, 1838 and 39 was when the major groups of Cherokee people, the largest groups of Cherokee people were forcefully removed from their homes, usually with a few belongings, but often were rounded up with little notice, like Joseph Vann was. So when him and his family were rounded up by members of the military, they also tried to burn his house down. And so you can see on the stairs in his house, there's a burn mark from where the ones doing the rounding up were throwing in burning logs. So you can still see that physical mark today that shows the hostility of the American government that was removing even a very prominent Cherokee person. So you can see the multiple routes taken with the state borders shown that would have been there at this time. And the purple section is what was known as Indian Territory. So you can see little sections blocked off for individual tribes. So tribes took different routes and lost different amounts of people. The Cherokee people lost a quarter of their population between those 2 years, the winter of 1938 to 39, and ended up in northeastern Oklahoma. So if you can imagine, which I can't, but leaving your homeland, that generations of your people had lived in, and walking to a place that you had never seen before or heard of. You didn't know what would be available. You didn't know if you would survive. So I've been lucky enough to be a part of a memorial project for the Trail of Tears, the Remember the Removal Bicycle Ride. So I have retraced the northern route of that trail on a bike. And so it's a journey of about 1,000 miles, and it's a partnership between the Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So the Eastern Band, since they are already living in Western North Carolina, they don't have the experience necessarily of, one, being in Oklahoma or making that trip. And then me and my family, we don't have the experience either of being in North Carolina in the beautiful mountains and then leaving it to come back to Oklahoma. So the two groups from the two different tribes have very different experiences when they do retrace that trail, because one's leaving home and one's coming back home. But in a way, we're both leaving home, right? So we all know that we came from this area, and that's where our roots lie. So the trail, like I said, killed a quarter of the population, and it was. Here are some more routes and just an older map showing you different historic sites. So you can see Chattanooga and Red Clay and New Eshota were essentially a starting point. This is Blythe Ferry, which you can also go visit. It's a historic site, so it is traditional log cabin build still, but it's a site where Cherokees would have been ferried across the Tennessee River to continue on with their journey on the trail. So after arriving in Indian Territory, it's often called the Golden Era, so it's just post-removal. It's an era of recovery, and essentially the Cherokees are starting over from scratch because they're not familiar with the area. They have to get familiar quickly to be able to start to cultivate food, find game, and essentially survive in a new environment. So in 1839, the Cherokees renew their constitution, and this would be the constitution for the Cherokee Nation. So we've seen that the Eastern Band and the Cherokee Nation are now two separate legal entities at this point. So there are treaty promises with the American government that sometimes were filled and sometimes were not, and those would be things like land allotments, giving out rations, farm implements, those kinds of things that help everyday life go on smoothly. Despite all that, the Cherokee Nation created schools, they maintained their government, and you're starting to see brick and mortar buildings. So this is the Cherokee Nation capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. It's still there. A lot of celebrations and gatherings are held on this lawn, and you can go tour the building if you find yourself in Tahlequah. So there were still log cabins the Cherokees were living in here, stick-built buildings as well, including the Merle home, which is a historic site today, as you can go see. And to create as much success as possible for the next generation, the Cherokees created male and female seminaries in 1851. So those would have been essentially community colleges, and they had trade educations, classical European educations that produced younger Cherokees that hopefully had the best chance possible navigating the new American government-influenced world. So the seminaries were 3-story brick structures, which would have been big time back then, and parts of those still stand today. So that's the middle of the 1800s. We all know what's coming, right? The Civil War. And so as far as building, you started seeing a lot of forts being stood up. And so those, as we know, were heavily fenced and had a few buildings to house people and troops. They were often used to keep Cherokees and other tribal members to, if they didn't know where to put them yet, since land assignments were changing, land holdings were shrinking. So it was for militaries and for tribal people who often had nowhere else to go. Not to say that they were havens, there were often really bad conditions, but they were there. And so those forts influenced how buildings were built and the communities functioned in a time of war. So the Civil War often pitted families against families all over America, right? But within the Cherokee Nation, you had individuals who sided with Union and Confederate forces, either voluntarily or by force. Some often wished that America would just figure out the Civil War, deal with that, and then not get the tribes involved, which, as we know, didn't happen. So at this time, too, there's war going on. There's change and confusion. So the American government institutes what we know now as blood quantum and rolls. So blood quantum was a way for the American government to determine basically the Indianness of an individual, whether they were full blood or mixed. And then rolls were essentially a census that you were able to sign up on, have your blood quantum on there, and those rolls are used today for all the 3 Cherokee bands to determine who has Cherokee descendancy. We're also in the middle of the boarding school era. So boarding schools were heavily influenced, usually, by Christian organizations. And boarding schools have been in the news a lot lately, which in a way is a good thing to be in the public eye, to understand that history of as assimilation policies, as well as mistreatment of Cherokee youth and all other tribes. So boarding schools were a way to separate Native youth from their families, which was an attempt to Americanize the natives, right? And to an extent it worked, because a lot of times the Native youth would come back home and not be able to speak their language. They may not know their traditional ways, and they might have been discouraged to learn them. So those effects are lasting till today. Then the late 1800s, there were a couple major acts that contributed to that fracturing. So 1887 was the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, and what that did was establish small tracts of land for different Cherokee individuals, sometimes based on blood quantum, sometimes based on treaty rights. So again, you're seeing these individual plots of land that are totally opposite of what we had seen with communal societies working together. Instead, they were small family units who would just maintain themselves, right? Not contribute to the greater good, because they were separated from everyone on their usually 160 acres. In 1898, the Curtis Act was passed, and that was the abolition of tribal governments. And so just over 100 years ago when that happened. So what we can see now in the next 100 years is tribes trying to recover their tribal governments, as well as obtain federal recognition. So we're moving into the 1900s. So 1907 in Oklahoma is a big year. So that's when we got statehood. But at this time, too, a notable statistic is that only 10% of land was held by Indians. So in a state or area that was considered Indian territory just, 50-ish years ago, now only 10% is held by Indians. So we'll move forward. We're getting closer to today. So mid-1900s, 1950s. Actually, let's see what slide's next. Okay. So tribes are recovering and establishing themselves in the 1900s as a lot of things are modernizing, a lot of technology advancements. So we're moving forward to this point, to modern day. But before we get there, in the 1950s, American government programs tried to disperse working age natives to metropolitan areas like San Francisco, Denver, Chicago, in an attempt to give them access to more jobs, right? So they were marketed as job programs, but in a way, even in modern times there, the 1950s, it was an attempt to get the younger natives away from their families, away from traditional ways, and they may not come back, right, to continue the learnings and the teachings. So that was a very, modern times, but still had those same effects that the previous acts have had on societies. So those metropolitan, or I guess urban, communities of natives that were dispersed based on these government programs still exist today. So there's still large native communities in Minneapolis, Denver, Oakland, which is great to see. So even though they were they represented a lot of different tribes, these communities have stayed strong still today, and they support each other. So a couple decades later, 1970s, was really a time where tribes were able to assert themselves as sovereign nations. A lot of them were gaining federal recognition back, maintaining relations with the American government, and then creating means and methods for economic development so they could continue taking care of their societies and communities like they had traditionally, just in a different way. So all of this nation building resulted in tribal headquarters buildings, and these campuses you can see in all states, pretty much. This just happens to be the Cherokee Nation headquarters, council building, offices, and this is in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, just down the road from the state capitol building we saw earlier. So tribes including Cherokee Nation, United Kituwa Band, and Eastern Band all have positive economic impacts on their local cities and state economies, which is really great to see, because when you have industries like gaming and hospitality often have a negative view, right? But the ability to have casinos and gaming operations, it resulted in the nation building that we see today. It allowed for economic diversity that we see today. A lot of tribes have a big, business side that creates that revenue diversity and allows for providing benefits to members, providing health care to members, community organizations, and all of that is what the mainstream society needs, but it also allows us to continue on as a people, to pass on our traditional knowledge, to preserve our language. We have tourism operations, right, which is a revenue creator, but it is also something that allows people outside Native communities to see who we are, see how we used to live, how we live now, and it's a way to keep our relations with cities, states, and the country in which we live, work, operate, all of that in a positive light. So tribes often have law enforcement officers as well that are cross-deputized, and they can help out in their local communities. There are tribally owned businesses that do federal contracting, private businesses. So just a lot of different ways that tribes operate that people don't often know about. So moving forward, 1976, the Cherokee Nation ratifies a new constitution. And these are pictures of modern day Cherokees doing their thing, right? So there's some traditional regalia, and then of course modern day clothing, the memorial bicycle riders in the top right, our Cherokee National Holiday is coming up on Labor Day weekend. That powwow is there in the bottom left as a celebration and competition. So we are a thriving people. We survive as 3 legal entities, right? But we are from the same roots. We're from the same homelands. And so now we know why there are 3 separate bands of the Cherokee Nation. Since there are 2 bands in northeastern Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation United Kituwa Band, they exist, but they continue to have political and religious and legal conflicts that have gone on since we got here got there to northeastern Oklahoma. But thankfully, there are efforts to heal all those relationships between the 3 bands and continue on with a similar mindset. So there's a tri-council that happens at regular intervals where the leaderships of the 3 bands meet and talk about major issues. So that's an advancement I see to get us more united like we originally were. So let's see what else I have. So here are the 3 tribes represented. So you see the 7-pointed star in all of our flags, and that is in reference to the 7 clans that our people have, and then 7 is an important number in other ways as well. So, and you can see the 1839 year on the Cherokee Nation flag in the bottom left. So that was when our the first Constitution of the Cherokee Nation was established. And then a view of a council meeting in the top left. So there are parallels between our history and the many other Native nations in what is now America. So there are about 570 federally recognized tribes in the U.S., more that are state recognized, some that are not recognized, and then others that didn't survive the removal and oppression that the Cherokee Nation experienced. So since there are so many other tribes, there are also a lot of different examples of traditional housing, society structures, and cultures within that big number of tribes because they were living in different climates, elevations, access to natural resources, and all those things that affect how a society operates. So removal and colonization affected all tribes in similar and unique ways, but all those effects are still felt and seen today. They just show up in different ways. So I'm speaking to you all today as decision makers and leaders in your organization. A lot of you influence how buildings are built, how communities function, how people live their everyday lives, and that's a lot of power. So I'm thinking a lot of you are like-minded with me, right? And you see value in different worldviews. So this is one worldview that to me is worth listening to and worth learning about because not only does it enrich your own worldview as someone who lives in traditional Cherokee homelands, but also learning about different worldviews, especially ones that are regenerative and long-lasting, can be a catalyst for positive change in our communities. So I believe that's it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lily. So, as you can see, that was a lot of history and context that really underpins the discussions that we're having today in terms of how we think about natural systems, how we think about people, right? And how all of the decisions we affect, all the decisions we make with the built environment affect both the environment and people. One quick little detail that I did want to add was that the city of Chattanooga was incorporated immediately after the Indian Removal Act. So this history is really deeply part of our community and part of this place. And there's a lot that we can learn both from the Cherokee culture and their incredible ability to adapt in the face of adversity, which is something that we're going to have to learn from as well.